Hi, I'm Mira. Welcome to another story. Let's see where this one takes us. The village of Eldertide sat precariously on the edge of the world, a cluster of weather-beaten cottages nestled against the cliffs, where the ocean's fury met the sky. The people lived by the sea's whims, their lives dictated by the tides and the storms that rose without warning. At the village's heart, towering over the square, was the sand sculpture of Thalos, their protector and judge. Each year, the villagers gathered to shape his likeness, their hands coaxing sacred patterns into the grains, their offerings placed carefully at his feet. Tradition said it was Thalos's favour that kept the storms at bay. Adrian Layton stood at the edge of the square, watching the villagers scurry about like ants before a rainstorm. His notebook hung limply in his hand, the wind tugging at its pages. He was used to scepticism, but Eldertide was something else entirely. Here, belief wasn't just a way of life, it was survival. "This is ridiculous," Adrian muttered under his breath. "A sand sculpture isn't going to stop a storm." "Careful who hears you say that." A voice broke through the wind, sharp and wry. Adrian turned to find a young woman standing beside him. Irelus, his guide for this strange endeavour, was everything the village seemed to embody, practical, sharp-eyed and weather-worn. Her braided hair was streaked with salt, her coat patched and sturdy. She crossed her arms, her expression an unreadable mix of amusement and irritation. "Let me guess," Adrian said, closing his notebook. "You're going to tell me Thalos is real?" Ira smirked faintly. "Depends on what you mean by real. What I know is this. Every year we build the sculpture. Every year the storm passes. Call it faith, call it coincidence. Either way it works." Adrian frowned, his gaze returning to the sculpture. "And if it doesn't?" Ira's smile faded. "Then we deal with the consequences. Like we always do." The storm's first whispers came that evening, carried on the sharp bite of the wind. Clouds rolled in, dark and menacing, swallowing the horizon. The villagers worked late into the night, adding the final touches to the sculpture. Adrian watched from the square's edge, his arms crossed against the cold. "What's this keystone everyone keeps talking about?" he asked as Ira approached with an armful of seaweed garlands. "It's the offering," Ira replied, her tone guarded. A carved shell placed at the heart of the sculpture. "It's symbolic." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Symbolic of what?" Ira hesitated. "The bond between the village and the sea, or something like that." "Something like that," Adrian repeated, smirking. She shot him a look. "You don't have to believe it, Leighton, but you'd better respect it." Before Adrian could respond, a commotion erupted near the sculpture. Villagers crowded around a man holding shards of something delicate and white. "The keystone!" he cried, his voice shaking. "It's broken!" A ripple of panic swept through the crowd. Adrian frowned, stepping closer to the sculpture where the sand around the pedestal had been disturbed. "It didn't break on its own," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Someone did this." The villagers' murmurs grew louder, their voices tinged with fear and anger. Old Thren, the village elder, stepped forward, his staff tapping against the stones. His eyes, sharp and cold, swept over the crowd. "This is a grave offence," Thren said, his voice steady but heavy with menace. "Without the keystone, Thalos will not protect us. We must find the culprit." The villagers turned to Adrian almost in unison, their suspicion palpable. He held up his hands. "You think I did this? I just got here." "Who else would?" someone shouted. "You don't believe in Thalos! You said so yourself!" Adrian's frustration boiled over, but Ira stepped between him and the crowd, her expression hard. "Enough," she snapped. "We don't have time for this. The storm is coming and we need to prepare." Thren's gaze lingered on Ira, his expression unreadable. "And what do you suggest we do, Lise?" Ira squared her shoulders. "Reinforce the seawall, tie down what we can, and move everyone to the meeting hall. Blaming the outsider isn't going to save us." Thren's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Adrian felt the weight of the villagers' eyes shift, their fear beginning to waver. Ira turned to Adrian. "If you're so sure this isn't Thalos's wrath, prove it. Help me figure out who broke the shell and why." Adrian nodded, his mind racing. If someone had sabotaged the festival, there had to be a reason. And if he couldn't find it, the storm wouldn't be the only thing tearing the village apart. The storm's fury was rising, each gust of wind tearing at the village with an almost feral intensity. Adrian and Ira pressed against the elements as they scoured the cliffside, the crashing waves below sending mist high into the air. The moonlight barely cut through the clouds, but Ira's lantern cast a flickering glow over the path. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "You're sure the shell was broken out here?" Adrian asked, shouting to be heard over the wind. Ira nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. "It's the most secluded spot near the square. Whoever did this wouldn't want to be seen." Adrian followed her gaze, spotting footprints in the slick sand leading toward the edge. A chill ran down his spine, and he wasn't sure if it was the wind or the realization of how precariously close they were to the drop. "There," Ira said, crouching and pointing to a cluster of footprints and scuff marks. In the faint light, Adrian could see the glint of broken shell fragments half buried in the sand. Ira picked one up, her brow furrowing. "It's fresh," she muttered, "not weathered at all." Adrian knelt beside her. "Who would go to this much trouble to sabotage their own festival?" "Someone with something to gain," Ira replied, her tone grim. "Thren has been pushing the idea that without Thalos, the village can't survive. Fear keeps him in power." "You think it was him?" Adrian asked, his skepticism laced with curiosity. Ira shrugged but didn't look at him. "Maybe. Or someone who believes in his vision enough to act on it. Either way, we can't ignore what's happening." Back in the village square, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The sand sculpture of Thalos loomed over the crowd like a ghost, its features softened by the wind and rain. Villagers moved between their homes and the meeting hall, carrying what they could salvage before the worst of the storm arrived. Adrian and Ira burst into the square, their clothes soaked and their faces pale with determination. They headed straight for Thren, who stood near the sculpture, his staff clutched tightly. "Thren," Ira called, her voice steady despite the wind. "We need to talk." The elder turned slowly, his expression hard. "Now is not the time for idle chatter, Lyce. The storm is nearly upon us." "This isn't idle." Ira shot back. She held up the broken fragment of the keystone shell. "We found this near the cliffs. Someone sabotaged the festival." Gasps rippled through the crowd and all eyes turned to Thren. His face darkened and he leaned heavily on his staff. "And what does that prove?" "It could have been anyone." Adrian stepped forward, "including you." The accusation sent a shockwave through the villagers. Thren's expression twisted into one of anger, but Adrian didn't back down. "You've spent years telling these people that Thalos's favour is the only thing keeping them safe," Adrian said, his voice rising. "But you've also kept them afraid of storms, of change, of anything that challenges your control." Thren raised his staff, pointing it at Adrian. "You speak as though you understand this village, outsider. But you don't. Thalos' favour is the only reason we've survived this long." "Then why break the shell?" Ira demanded, stepping beside Adrian. "Why sabotage your own ritual? I did no such thing!" Thren thundered, but his voice wavered, and the villagers around him began to whisper. His control over them was slipping, and he could feel it. "You didn't need to break it yourself," Adrian pressed. "You just needed to plant the idea. Keep the village in fear, and they'll turn to you. But that fear isn't helping anyone. It's killing them." The villagers' murmurs grew louder, their suspicion turning toward Thren. For the first time, his authority seemed fragile, his figure smaller against the storm-darkened sky. A sudden cry drew everyone's attention. One of the villagers pointed toward the cliffs where the seawall was buckling under the weight of the waves. Water surged over the edge, spilling into the lower streets and rushing toward the square. "We need to reinforce it," Ira shouted. "Now!" The villagers hesitated, torn between fear and action. Thren raised his staff, his voice desperate. "Thalos will punish those who act against his will." "No," Ira yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We don't need Thalos to save us. We need each other." Adrian joined her, his voice steady and commanding. "The seawall is our last line of defence. If we lose it, we lose everything. We don't need prayers. We need action." Slowly, hesitantly, the villagers began to move. They grabbed sandbags, wooden planks, and anything else they could find, forming a line toward the seawall. Ira led the charge, her determination infectious, while Adrian directed the efforts with an efficiency born of desperation. Thren stood frozen in the square, his staff trembling in his hand. The storm was no longer his weapon. It was a test he couldn't control. For hours, the villagers fought against the storm, their unity a bulwark against the elements. Together they reinforced the seawall, shoring up gaps and redirecting the surging water. The storm raged, but it couldn't break them. By dawn, the worst had passed. The village was battered, but standing, its people exhausted, but alive. In the square, the sand sculpture of Thalos was little more than a mound, washed away by the rain. Ira stood with Adrian at the edge of the square, watching as the villagers began to pick up the pieces of their lives. She turned to him, her expression softening. "Looks like you were right," she said. "We didn't need Thalos after all." Adrian smiled faintly. "You were right too. What you have here, this community, that..." The village of Eldertide awoke to an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred by its fury. The air was thick with salt and rain-soaked earth, and the faint light of dawn revealed the extent of the damage. Broken shutters hung from houses, debris clogged the streets, and pools of seawater reflected the pale sky. Ira stood in the square, her arms crossed tightly as she surveyed the remnants of Thalos' sculpture. Once a towering monument of faith and tradition, it was now a misshapen mound of sand, its intricate details erased by the storm's relentless assault. The villagers moved around her, tired but alive, their movements slow and uncertain. Adrian approached, his boots crunching on the wet cobblestones. He carried a bucket of nails and tools salvaged from the wreckage of a nearby shed. His coat was torn, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes carried a quiet determination. "How bad is it?" he asked, nodding toward the square. Ira exhaled. "Bad, but it could have been worse." The seawall held, thanks to everyone pulling together. Her lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "Even you, outsider." Adrian chuckled softly, setting the bucket down. "I figured I had to earn my keep. How's the mood?" Ira's expression darkened slightly. Shaken. Thren's grip on the village isn't what it was, but people don't just abandon tradition overnight. Adrian glanced toward the meeting hall, where villagers huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. At the edge of the crowd stood Thren, his staff planted firmly in the ground. He looked smaller than before, the lines of his face deeper, his authority cracked but not broken. "What's he planning?" Adrian asked. "Nothing good," Ira muttered. "But he won't act openly now. The villagers saw what we did, how we worked together to save the seawall. That's a stronger argument than anything he can preach." Later that morning, the villagers gathered in the square to assess the damage and decide their next steps. Adrian and Ira stood at the centre, surrounded by faces lined with exhaustion and doubt. Thren lingered on the outskirts, his staff clutched tightly, his gaze sharp. Ira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Last night we faced the worst storm this village has seen in years. And we survived, not because of Thalos, but because of us, because we worked together." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some of agreement, others uncertain. Ira pressed on. "For generations we've built this sculpture, believing it would protect us. But when it fell, we didn't fall with it. We stood our ground, we built barriers, we reinforced the seawall, and we proved that our strength doesn't come from sand or rituals, it comes from each other." A few villagers nodded, their faces softening. Others glanced uneasily at Thren, who stepped forward, his voice rising like a challenge. "And what of Thalos' blessing?" he demanded. "Do you truly believe we survived without his favour? That the storm would not have claimed us if not for the traditions we uphold?" Ira met his gaze without flinching. "What I believe, Thren, is that fear has ruled this village long enough. You've kept us looking backward, clinging to rituals that can't hold back the tide. But last night we saw the truth. We don't need fear to survive. We need each other." The crowd shifted, their attention wavering between Ira and Thren. Adrian took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Tradition has its place. It brings people together, gives them purpose. But it can also be used to control. The storm didn't choose sides, it was just a storm, and you faced it because you chose to, not because of some offering." Thren's face twisted with anger, but he said nothing. The villagers, however, began to murmur again, their voices growing louder. A woman stepped forward, her hands calloused from years of work. Aira's right, she said. We didn't need the sculpture. We needed each other. One by one, others joined in, their voices building into a chorus of agreement. Thren's grip on his staff aft tightened, but the fight had left him. He turned and walked away, his figure hunched, his authority broken.
By midday,
the square was alive with activity. Villagers worked side by side to clear debris, repair homes, and rebuild what the storm had taken. The sculpture of Thalos remained a mound of sand untouched. No one spoke of rebuilding it. Adrian leaned against a cart, watching as Ira directed a group repairing the seawall. She moved with purpose, her voice steady and encouraging. He approached her, a small smile on his face. "You make a pretty good leader," he said. Ira glanced at him, smirking. "Don't push your luck, Leighton," he chuckled, but his tone softened. "You were right. This village doesn't need outsiders like me to save it. You've got everything you need right here." Ira's smirk faded into a genuine smile. "Maybe, but I think we needed someone to remind us of that." Together, they watched as the village came alive again, the storm's scars already fading under the weight of renewed hope. Tradition hadn't saved them, but unity had, and that was a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. Thanks for listening. If the story stuck with you, come back next time for another journey.